I am live again with Adrian Courage discussing part two of his book. So how are you doing, Adrian?
Good, thanks. Very well.
Yeah, so a little update slash review here for those tuning in or listening, however that you do so, is we spoke a couple weeks ago for part one of the book, which basically was I read half of it. We kind of talked about it and a few other little things. And we wanted to do a part two after I finished the book. Technical note, we recorded last week and something happened to the recording. That's why you might see this on the internet live, is because I want to make sure I get the recording this time. Sometimes things happen with that. So today we're going to get into a little bit, a few more things on the book and related philosophical topics like dualism, which of course is important to the book. For those of you who may be tuning in on the video, however that you do so, either on Facebook or on YouTube later, we'll have this image up, which actually is in the book. I missed it in the book because I used my Kindle to read it to me for most of it. And now I just went through and I found it in the Kindle version of the book. So you can find this in the book, but it's a image that cuts off the bottom in this one, but that's okay. So
I never managed to find out what the things were in the top corner, in the four corners.
Okay.
What it says.
Oh, the
But it
Latin.
doesn't seem more that important. It's just people.
Yeah, well,
and this is in Germany, so these are German crests of some kind.
Okay, right. Because so you talked a bit about this book a few times, or I talked a little bit about this image a few times in your book. And I didn't realize at the time that there was an image in the book, so I pulled off the internet, and it's a really interesting one. And I guess you originally found it in Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about this image, because it's pretty pivotal and symbolic for everything that you get into in your book.
Well, the image is a tree at the center of it, the tree of life and death. But the interesting thing is that it's surrounded by biblical figures, Adam and Eve. So Adam is sitting at the base of the tree. He's looking feeling sorry for himself. And Eve is standing up, taking the fruit, the forbidden fruit, or the apple, whichever you prefer, from the snake, the serpent, and giving it to some downtrodden people to her right, including a skeleton. One of them's a skeleton. And to Adam's left, sorry, his right, but our left, to the left of Adam, is Mary, who's taking the sacrament from the tree and feeding it to more deserving people, I guess. I don't know exactly who they are, but they appear to be the pious, I guess. Right. So immediately it sets up this juxtaposition of the feminine, of Eve and Mary,
right, the
whore and the mother, so to speak. And also in the tree you have the skeleton, not a skeleton, a skull. And to the right above Eve, and to the left above Mary you have Christ on the cross. So what all this kind of combines is the story of Genesis with the story of the crucifixion.
Yeah, the gospel.
So and it's the juxtaposition between life and death, where life is represented by Christ,
right,
on the cross. So I guess that would suggest the path that Adam should be following. The problem with Adam is he's sitting on the floor. He's covered his eyes,
Yeah.
so he doesn't see Eve, and he's turned his back on Mary, so he doesn't see her either. So this is his fall, I guess. And also from his groin. So the tree rises up from his groin. I've seen images of Adam with the tree growing from his groin. The tree of life, I guess. And
the snake kind of has him intertwined by his arm too.
The snake has him trapped, and the snake is feeding Eve, obviously. So he's a real loser in this picture. And his task as a man, this is my interpretation, is to take up the cross and sacrifice himself for the good, so to do good. And that's how he can reconcile life and death, and also free Eve from the snake, which is his snake, right? If the snake is coming from his groin. Okay, I need to explain that better, I think.
No, it's good. It's good. You talked a lot about it in the book, and so can you tell us as we kind of get into this a little bit, the podcast in reference to your book, that you actually did a good job of in introducing this image, which I don't know if it's officially an alchemical image. No, it's not an alchemical image. It's just like probably 14th century art or 15th century, maybe Renaissance art.
Yeah, something like that.
And can you refer more to how it ties into your book? Because you mention it a number of times in the book, and this has a lot to do with a subject that we'll get into a bit more over the next hour or so, which is dualism. So there's a few different things that we call dualism. Some of it is, spirit and the physical world or material world. And then some of it is just dual aspect things like life and death, or some of the other things that are symbolized in this picture. But can you tell us a little bit more about how this ties into your book?
Well, I was exploring themes of the masculine and the feminine.
Yeah.
Which can be defined as chaos and order.
Right.
Where the feminine is chaos and the masculine is order. And also as dark and light, or any number of ways, essentially.
Right.
And so I kind of made a decision I came to the conclusion that in order to the masculine has to prevail over the feminine to some extent in order for chaos to be
at bay,
abated. Yeah, because the feminine is not the female necessarily, but the feminine in symbolism is represented by it represents chaos.
Right. Which I think that's something important to mention here is, and you sort of get into this in the book, but sometimes it gets confusing, and you sort of mention it there, is that this is about masculine and feminine, not exactly male, female, because in every male, there's different aspects of masculinity and femininity, and in every female, there's also different aspects of femininity and masculinity. They just manifest more overtly in males and females the way that they do because of our roles for child rearing and childbearing, and
Yeah.
our roles in even sexuality, our roles in society. And I mentioned this a few times just podcasting, but I think it's underappreciated. Like, there's a lot of new technologies that have happened over history, and or a lot of different subjects and all kinds of things. But the biggest one that we take for granted as far as changing the world is birth control.
Yeah.
And because that doesn't just change that in anything simple, it changes the very fabric of our reality, of how we interact with people, how that we're forced to mature, how that we have more time to put off maturity, how we have more time to put off children, how that sometimes we can be more promiscuous without so many consequences to think about the same way, and so many other things. So the masculine and the feminine is an important aspect, and also one to remember that it's inside of everyone, and this image really represents that. I wanted to mention too that I don't always mention this explicitly, but this is sort of the symbolism generally that I try to get at when I say daily archetype. It's not
Yeah.
just that I try to publish things on an almost daily basis or whatever. It's that there's an archetype of the day, which is destruction and renewal. And that's a part of life that we often forget, is that to have the joys of life also comes with appreciating what comes with its finitude of having it sort of encapsulated in death.
Yeah.
And so there's a constant, not just in the physical, but also in our practical ongoing lives. There's always a dying and a rebirth happening, whether we partake in it or not. And yeah, so I found this image super interesting. And there's also a lot of strange time things going on here, because of course, at least in the stories, you've got Mary and Eve, who are in the stories thousands of years apart, but they're right next to each other here.
Yeah.
And the story of Mary was to bring forth the Savior out of her innocence. And then so she's giving the sacrament, which of course is what he gives in the story after his death. So it's, which kind of ties it in all these like strands of symbolism, which
Correct.
are like you say, accepting our suffering, which is roughly the idea of the sacrament, to accept your suffering and to accept your role in the destruction of the Savior.
Correct. Right.
So,
And
so
what
yeah, go ahead.
first struck me about this
Yeah.
image was the juxtaposition of Eve and
Mhm.
Mary together.
Mhm.
Because
Right.
this is, in Hungarian, we have the expression, nem lehet egyszerre baszni meg szűz maradni, which
Okay.
means you can't stay, you can't fuck and stay a virgin, which is kind of your idea of birth control.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
So in a world where you can't fuck and stay a virgin,
Mhm.
you get this juxtaposition in women of their desire and what it means to be a woman. So the desire of the female sexual desire, it can be quite destructive, but it can also be repressed and overcome, I guess, by Mary, if the woman takes on the role of Mary, which is the caregiver, the sacrificial figure who gives up her youth essentially. So that was the big thing here for me. The first thing that struck me about this image was the duality of the feminine. So you have Eve and her sexual desire on one side, and you have Mary and the sacrament on the other.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about the story of Mary, it's a theological story that's been debated for these centuries, which is, and Jung gets into this a lot, I think in Aeon, which is something I'll mention probably at the end of this, is that next month we'll dive into some like short book reviews that we'll do together, and one of those will probably be Aeon. But one of the things that he talks about, well, that, and also in Answer to Job, which is important on these subjects, is the Assumption of Mary, which is basically when the Catholic Church in, I think, like the 1940s or 50s said that they made official in their doctrine what that they have been acting like for 1,000+ years, which is that Mary isn't just a person, she's a deity. And that's been a big thing for
in the Orthodox traditions.
Yeah, it's been a heavily debated and contested thing, because and I would say in psychological terms, it's kind of a dangerous thing, because you maybe dangerous isn't the word, but you're to the Assumption of Mary, to me, is to miss the point of the gospel, which is to project out our role onto another made-up deity. Just like we go through in history, we go from like a pantheon of gods to a hierarchy, to where then they kind of coalesce onto a monotheism, and then that gets destroyed, like with the Greeks, and then with what happened with the Christian tradition. And then when they coalesce again, then they start to disintegrate into a trinity, which isn't in the Bible, and they start to disintegrate into not just Mary being assumed as a deity, but also the apostles being assumed as deities. And then it goes on into this disintegration into a pantheon again. And what that is us as individuals and collective or collective cultures, reflecting and projecting out our inner state of this competition for personalities, which of course the archetypal, sort of use Jungian terms of that monotheist perspective, is the self. But the feminine is not another deity. That is where I think that we have made the mistake in history. And it's fine to use symbols like even Mary, even this image, and all the other symbols throughout history of the Great Mother and all these things, those of symbols. But when we project it out onto a new deity, what we're doing is we are denying the feminine within ourselves.
Right.
Because because the role in the gospel is to say the feminine is the church, and you can take that however literally you want, in terms of you need to go to a specific church or whatever, but the church is basically those who prepare themselves to be united with Christ, because that is the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ is not his mom. The bride of Christ is the church. And so
Yeah.
the idea is that the feminine is that which is within inside of us, each person, and as a community, as that we try to relate to the self, relate to God or whatever. And then we interact with the totality of all being, whether you want to call that God, the self, or whatever God you pick. You interact that with that in a certain feminine way, whether you want to call that submissive or whatever. But does that help at all in terms of what you're trying to get at in your book? Because sometimes I just try to straighten out some of this symbolism where I think even Jung was challenged because it's so complex over the millennia.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the idea of Mary bringing down the sacrament from the tree at Christ's feet,
right,
and passing it on to the believers, let's call them that, I don't know, suggests just that she's the messenger, essentially. She's the bearer of the sacrament.
Right. A
She
symbol.
she isn't the sacrament itself.
Right. She's not necessarily a deity, but she's a symbol for how we are to act and how we are to be.
But the point is that, as far as I can tell,
right.
This is my own opinion of this.
Sure.
Is that you have the duality of the woman, right? That's very, very clear in this image.
Right.
You have Eve and you have Mary. Mary is the Virgin Mother, right? The Virgin Mary. Like this, it's an impossible. You cannot be a virgin and be a mother.
Yeah, and be a mother. Right.
So that's Mary's situation, right? That she's a virgin mother.
Right.
Which is impossible, which is an impossible ideal to aim for.
Right.
And then there's Eve, who is innocent in her nakedness, and who is then tempted to have sex by the serpent. And the symbolism of the serpent is very clear when it comes to sexuality, right? She's tempted by the serpent emerging from Adam's groin. So, yeah. And she has that idea before Adam does, or at least Adam is of the opinion that, or Adam is worried about what God would say if he ate the apple or ate the forbidden fruit. Of course, God knows that they will eat it sooner or later, right? Because as they grow up, as they become mature, the sexual act becomes more and more essential.
So there's a lot of tellings of this story in these sexual ways, and some more symbolic throughout the centuries and millennium, perhaps. I think there's a very practical way to look at it, which is, and to sort of use Jungian terms, which is that we have the self within us, which you could also just maybe even call something like what do you call it? The conscience. So we have the conscience within us, and the conscience tells us, so again, just practically, if there's anything that we know not to do, steal a candy bar, kick a puppy, do a immoral sexual act, whatever that it might be, we know not to do it. There's the innocent us that knows not to do it, that has heard the voice of the self saying, don't do that. If you do it, you'll be destroyed. And then there is committing the act, and then there's after the act, because after the act you're sort of like Adam in this picture,
Yeah.
which is that you have remorse, not just over some bearded guy in the sky that won't walk with you anymore and you hide from him or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's self-alienation. You've alienated yourself from your own conscience, and we see this in literature and movies, I think, and even TV shows. The last 10 or 20 years have gotten really good at this, at showing this process of self-corruption, where a person goes against their own values, and then they have to justify it, and then they want to redeem themselves. So then they're left with kind of the option of either redeeming themselves the right way, which is to sort of, to use again sort of biblical terms, repent, turn from it. But what will happen in self-corruption is they come up with a bigger and bigger scheme of how to justify what that they did, and how to make it, and how to redeem themselves, when the ego can't redeem the self. To use Jungian terms, the self has to redeem the ego. But again, this is things that you get into in your book. So what was that like, going through that process in the context of your book?
Well, one of my favorite passages in the book is where I imagine Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and what actually happens. So Adam shows up after the event. So the serpent has already tickled Eve, so to speak. She's already felt the power of the female orgasm.
Okay.
And then you remember this bit?
Sort of.
Dig it out, because find it.
Was it around the time when you had your female orgasm?
No, it was much later.
Okay. So
and anyway, so she has her orgasm without Eve, without Adam there, and then Adam shows up and sees she's all flushed and stuff, and aroused, and then his serpent starts to rise, and she's like, "Yeah, let's go." And so they do it, and the act, and then Adam feels really remorseful, as you said, and gets the fig leaves out and says, "Okay, let's cover ourselves up and never do this again, because God said." And Eve is like, "Hey man, I thought we were just getting started." She didn't feel remorseful, because that's what she's there for, right? The sexual act is the most divine act that can be enjoyed, and it's pleasurable, right? Which is a great mystery of evolution, is why our sexual act is pleasurable, whereas other animals just get it done and get it out of the way, except dolphins, of course.
Yeah, dolphins. It's
there's this aspect of the story where Eve loses her innocence, and she wants to do more of it, whereas Adam's immediately pious and got what would God say, and we're in big trouble now. And she's like quite reckless about it. This is how I imagine it, because she's already been tempted by the serpent, right? So she's already eaten the forbidden fruit, so she knows what's going on at that point. So that's one of my favorite parts of the book, where I uncover this in a more poetic way, I guess.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind there. One, the Robert Greene talks a lot about this, I think, in a couple of his books, and it's a big thing, I think, in his book he's going to publish probably next year on the sublime, or
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
yeah, well, because the sublime, has to do with a lot of what we're talking about here, even in context to this image, which is that life and death and paradox, there's a if you sort of appreciate them, it's a sublime thing. It's paradoxical.
Yeah.
And what one of the ways that he ties that together is how that the sexual act, I'm no French expert or anything like that, but he mentions a couple times how the French word, or one of the French words for orgasm, is something like le
Le
petit
Petit
mot.
Mort.
Yeah. Did you ever mention? I don't think you mentioned it in your book.
I think I did.
Did you? Okay.
The little death.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think you did mention that in the book, because, and it kind of, it can feel that way. Although it's strange to even talk about, because of course you can't exactly experience death and live to tell about it completely. I mean, there's some who had near-death experiences or whatever, but it can kind of feel that way. A good orgasm can feel like you've kind of died and come back. And so it's kind of like this paradoxical position that you talk about in your book, and this image and everything, which is life and death in the same moment. And of course, naturally that can lead to the life of another person and all the people who have come into being. Well, unless they're like a test tube baby. It started with that. So I don't, maybe we should get into the dualism aspect a little bit,
Sure.
because you that's sort of what you mean by your title, Mandula.
Yes.
And so can you tell us a little bit more what you mean by that, and what your position is on dualism?
Well, the mandorla is the intersection of two circles. So if you think of the MasterCard
Yeah.
logo, it looks like that. And in the middle, between the two circles, is a shape. It's formed like an almond.
Okay.
That's what mandorla means. It doesn't have a very long Wikipedia entry. It's like half a page. But it's in the Owning Your Own Shadow book at the end, which kind of is incongruous that it's in there. And just as this image isn't really fully explained or explained at all in Owning Your Own Shadow.
Right.
So both of these things I found in Owning Your Own Shadow. And so the mandorla signifies the meeting, the conjunction of life and death, light and dark, heaven and earth, usually heaven and earth. So, so that was something that really got a hold of me, because it showed with my bipolar disorder, which I didn't realize I had at the time.
Right.
I was going from being really, really high, ecstatic, euphoric, to being low. And the time when I could write my book was in the middle. So when I was in the mandorla, that was when I was able to create. Because sometimes I'd be too high to create. It wouldn't make much sense. And so I found that the conscious and unconscious, pretty much anything you can say, you can find an opposite for.
A dual aspect to it.
Yeah, like a shadow side of it, or a positive side of anything. Anything negative has a positive.
Yeah, which is something I want to mention too, is how one thing that I don't think is talked about enough, maybe even in Jung's writing, is to integrate the shadow. You need to integrate the persona, which is its opposite,
Mhm.
which I think is what you do, maybe less, maybe more implicitly and less explicitly in the book. You're demonstrating how, by telling your whole story unashamedly, or
Right.
very forthcoming, even though maybe you should be ashamed,
Yeah, yeah.
it disintegrates your shadow. And by integrating, well, it disintegrates your persona, which simultaneously sort of disintegrates your shadow and it starts to integrate them. So do you feel like that was sort of the process of um, letting down the mask and letting people sort of behind the veil of what's there, of a regular person, and seeing the shadow rather than the persona? And do you think that's sort of the process of integrating the shadow and the persona into our ego consciousness and our lived lives?
It's absolutely that's absolutely what it is. And people like Jordan Peterson has his what is it? Journaling, self-journaling, what's it called?
Self-authoring.
Self-authoring program, which you can download and
Mm-hmm.
complete.
Mm-hmm.
And that you write down the worst possible thing that can happen to you,
Mm-hmm.
like how you could, if you do things wrong, how bad things can get,
Mm-hmm.
and also your upward trajectory is, like what you really like to do, and what your dream is, whatever, in your job or your life or whatever.
Yeah, it kind of puts you in that in the middle of another duality, kind of
So
running
so
from
that's
hell to
exactly
heaven.
that's exactly what I did. Basically, I
Mm.
did a self-authoring
Mm.
program where as I went along, I wrote things down, if
Mm-hmm.
not as they happened, and close enough.
Right.
And I also did things to be able to put them in the book,
Oh
which
yeah.
also gave me a clearer idea of what you can get away with and what you can't get away with.
Right.
So I went to a New Year's Eve party
Mm.
where I didn't know anyone, and they were on drugs, and it was a disaster. And
Yeah.
that was too far to go, basically. And it really
Yeah.
depressed me that I've been such a fool to think that that could work out.
Yeah, it's interesting. That seemed kind of like a foreshadowing of what was to come. I think a lot of us, whether it's dreams or it's situations like that, now that we're kind of like coming out of the pandemic here in the middle of 2022, we can, maybe it's projection, but we can see foreshadowing events leading up to the pandemic, and that kind of seems like one of them for you, where
Yeah,
New Year's
right.
Eve 2020, you're thinking everything's gonna be fun and cool and normal or whatever, and then it just turns into a sad experience. Which is
Yeah, it really
something in
was,
the, you
crushed
go,
me.
oh
Yeah.
really?
Yeah, it really depressed me.
That yeah. Well, so the other aspect of the duality or the dualism that we're sort of getting into, because we didn't last time, and it's an important aspect of the book, is a sort of metaphysical dualism, which I think often we talk about it um not so overtly, but almost just inferring it. And that's kind of what we do here sometimes, and what you do in your book, which is there's, like, who was it, Descartes, who came up with this whole idea of there's this physical world, but there's also this spiritual world that acts upon it, or vice versa, whatever.
Yeah.
So we have to at some point reconcile our own philosophy of, do we believe that there's a spiritual world, or some people are just purely, sometimes they're called physicalist, and other things like that, where they don't
Materialist. No?
materialist, yeah, as another where they don't believe anything at all spiritual. And then another way of looking at it, and some, like I was talking to you the other day about Bernardo's book on Jung's metaphysics. He basically says from his writing that Jung was a dual aspect, what do you call it, a dual aspect materialist, or basically saying, no, I think there's another word for it, but basically saying, but dual aspect, saying that the world seems to have this duality of spirit and material, and Jung was definitely not purely a materialist, but also at the same time not purely spiritual, saying that we're sort of superseded by a spiritual order. So what say you? Is there a spiritual order, or is everything physical? Does it seem like there's a spiritual order, and why is that, or what's going on there in that regard to you?
Well, at the time I didn't realize. At the time I thought I was being incredibly insightful.
Okay.
But I had these things like a female orgasm, and just generally feeling high on life, like beyond what's normal, beyond high on life because of discovering duality, because I just was having insights that were really deep and meaningful. And I felt almost on a daily basis, totally taken away by my thoughts, totally absorbed in how amazing my insight was. But then, of course, it wasn't my insight, because these things have all been written down by other people. So it's not like I can say, this is me and I'm the person who's come up with this for the first time. But I was able to write things down in hopefully a new way, and that got me really high when I wrote something down, and I thought, wow, this is really done a really great job of writing this down. And that was my absolute high. And those were spiritual moments for me. In answer to your question, I totally was taken away by how creative I could be, the human creation. And that was for me, that was heaven. And then I would come back down to earth and realize, who's going to ever read this, and how am I going to pay the bills and all this kind of stuff, all the earthly problems. And I would come down with a bump and have to reevaluate and come to terms with all the stuff I didn't write down. Because the stuff I written down was maybe too abstract, not grounded enough in reality for my readers, who I consider to be not particularly spiritual people, let's say. So I'm not trying to compete with Jung or anyone else. I'm trying to just tell my own story, and as best I can. That was always my aim. But of course, I got tangled up in reading Jung and Nietzsche and Freud and whoever else. I got deep into the topics, but I didn't want to rehash what other people have already said. So I had to do it from my own perspective, and that was a process of reconciling heaven and earth and meeting them somewhere in the middle.
So do you think the spiritual and the material are literal, or they just seem that way? Because that's kind of the debate between someone who is maybe what you'd call spiritual versus material, is if that they believe there is a spiritual world, or if it just seems that way. What do you say?
I say there is a spiritual world. It's your own spiritual world. It's your own world of world of dreams and imaginations and things you haven't created yet. All the things you don't yet know. Everything that's on the other side, your own shadow, it's all in the spiritual realm. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a more literal sense, like the debate is, and like this is almost like it almost feels like how Jordan Peterson is tough with the question of believing in God. And she's like, oh, who can answer such a question?
Right. That's a bit lame, I think.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the same thing as this question, because
if you want to ask me if I believe in God, I'd say totally, I absolutely believe in God.
like a literal spiritual being that encapsulates the universe, or something like that.
Okay, what I believe is that there's a state of collective consciousness in the world that is constantly expanding with new scientific developments and new literature, new people, so we're constantly expanding our collective consciousness and also individual consciousness. So I believe that that's a natural process that happens with scientific advancement. But we have to do it in a way that turns towards the good, which is to look towards God.
Right. Well, to go in a direction more like heaven and less like hell.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that doesn't explain why I think there's God, why I believe there's God.
Yeah,
I can't really explain
tricky.
that. That's not easy to explain.
Well, it's tricky because, okay, so it kind of gets into this philosophical question of like, what is consciousness? And some would say consciousness includes whatever happened during and whatever was before the Big Bang, and it would include the heat death of the universe, and it would include even right now, whatever that now means, of like a black hole on the other side of our physical universe. Those things are all physical things, but what that they are is they are exchanges of material information.
Yeah.
And the material information at some point, you could say, needed a self-reflecting entity to experience non-physical information exchange, which is what a conscious being is. A conscious being, like especially a human, who we might say is the pinnacle of a conscious being that we can interact with. We can interact with ourselves and other human beings, and we have that self-reflective capacity that we don't exactly see in nature the same way, at least not on the same definitely not on the same time frame.
Right. So we're able to develop ourselves. We're able to further our knowledge from generation to generation, pass it on, teach each other, write things down to be shared.
Right.
And all of that is creation. And all of that is heavenly, godlike.
Yeah, it's an you could call it an evolution of consciousness, an evolution of awareness, an evolution of our reflective ability.
Yeah, which has nothing to do with Darwinism,
Right.
which is evolution and survival of the fittest species.
Yeah. Although it's one of those metaphor or not metaphor, but comparison that's, like you say, it's not exactly literal, but it kind of is, in that as the universe, including the biological universe which in we live, or the world of carbon-based life forms, that is Earth, the only world that we know that has organic life as we know it, it has progressed over time. That's roughly what the biological Darwinism is. It's that biological level, but
Right.
with that also comes social Darwinism, comes the so evolution kind of gets confusing in those terms, and that's why sometimes we stop and we clarify. We're not specifically talking about Darwin, but it's more like just to say there is a progression from less to more.
Yeah.
That's what we've seen throughout history. We're different now, here in 2022, as people that communicate over Skype and record podcasts and write books and all this other stuff, compared to people, primitive people hundreds or thousands of years ago. Now, some would say, and this is the another sort of philosophical debate in this context, is that that's actually been a sort of regression, that the sort of pinnacle was the more primitive people, and this is something that we've gotten into with, like, you've all know Harari's book Sapiens, and some others. So since we're on that question here briefly, what do you think that is going on there, where that some would say we're already at the pinnacle when we were in a primitive state, and now how do you see that it is a progression to like where we're at now? Do you call that a progression, or can you see how it's a regression in some way? But what do you say in those terms?
I think we romanticize
Yeah.
primitive peoples,
Mm.
and although they have their own symbolism and art and values, I'm not sure that they are, they're not as nearly as advanced as we are, let's say, or
Yeah.
nearly as capable as we are of dealing
Right.
with dealing with life, essentially.
Did you ever see this old movie? I think it was in the 80s, called The Gods Must Be Crazy.
No.
It'd be interesting in these contexts. Maybe one day we'll get into it. But the whole premise of the movie, and I haven't seen it for a really long time, but the whole premise of the movie is that there's these African, primitive people, primal villagers, whatever, and at some point there's just a guy who flies overhead in his little airplane, and he throws a Coke bottle out his window of his airplane, and it lands with these primitive people that don't have a lot of tools, and so it causes this huge problem in the village, because they think it's like a gift from God, and some people think it's like this amazing tool for whatever that they can do with this Coke bottle. So I kind of look at it in that context, in that when we are in that primitive state that people sort of romanticize, as you say, it's because we've sort of integrated how to be one with everything, one with nature, one with ourselves, one with our tribe or village, whatever. But then as that we've sort of, some would say, evolved too quickly over the last however many hundreds or thousands of years, we've gotten all these new tools. We've gotten Coke bottles, and we've gotten the internet, we've gotten hyperconnectivity to the world and all this new information. and we haven't integrated it yet. So the sort of regression is, like we talked about in some of our podcasts before, how the devil, so to speak, is the disintegration or the disassociation aspect. And so now we're reintegrating, and then that, I think, is the evolution that we're fighting through right now, is how to integrate all these tools into something that progresses towards the good rather than disassociation. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about.
Mhm.
There's the striving to be good
Mhm, mhm.
versus the forces of, forces of evil. I mean, this is what Star Wars is all about, right?
Yeah,
The light and the dark side of the
dark side.
Force. The Jedi, being a Jedi, what does that mean to be a Jedi? You know,
Right.
to be mind over matter
Mm,
and heroic,
right.
and striving for what's good and right and proper, even though there may be a small number of you and you might be vastly outnumbered by those working for the dark side. And the dark side may have horrendous weapons at its disposal,
Right.
but you still have to follow the light, right? Because there's no alternative.
So, in your book, and we mentioned this last time when I was able to save the recording, but you mentioned this word. I think it kind of fits in this context, which is an online participation mystique.
Yeah.
And can you say a little bit more what you meant by that, by online participation mystique?
This participation mystique, I think, is used by Freud quite often.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And I just kind of dropped it into the conversation. But
Okay.
Participation mystique is where a group of people
Mm,
become completely enamored with their own participation in
mm,
the world. It's like a crowd at a football game,
right.
or sports, following sports teams, or church, or whatever, wherever there's a big group of people together who have
Right.
the same view on or set of values.
Right.
And online participation mystique is where this mob becomes active online, and they have this mystique that because they found so many people to agree with them,
Yeah.
then they must be right.
Which is interesting. Okay, because the participation mystique, it I think originally has a lot to do with child development and developmental psychology, which is, when we're born, we don't exactly even know that there's us separate from everything else. It's just like existence. And then as we develop our ego consciousness, when we're somewhere between about 5 to 10 years old, depending on the individual and the culture they're in, then at some point they've really figured out there's a separation between them and what they are. They're an individual compared to everything else. And so before that, there's just like it's also called mystical participation, which means like you're just in the world but you don't realize, like when there's people and objects and everything coming at you, you don't realize there's a difference between that and you as an individual. But then it happens again in adulthood when we immerse ourselves in anything. So it can be your work, it can be an event of a crowd of people, it can be all kinds of things. And I don't think this is exactly how you mentioned it in the book, because in the book you were talking more just about how people were getting, I think, around, the whole COVID things and everything. But you sort of experienced a similar thing in a different way, and it kind of coincided with everything else going on in your life at the time, which is conspiracies leading to pathology. So that's maybe the one of the most interesting parts for me. Well, the most interesting parts for me were becoming Christ-like for
Yeah.
you, and then also your
Let's think
conspiracies.
about that for a moment, because
Yeah,
if you have the duality of the two
yeah.
women,
Hmm.
one is Mary and the other is Eve,
Right.
and that if that is to be consolidated in a single woman, then my interpretation was that Adam should become the tree and unite the two sides of the woman. So the duality is strongest in the woman,
Mhm.
and Adam must become Christ. So Adam must move from bottom to top in order to reconcile Eve and Mary.
Right.
Right. So that's otherwise the
Right.
alternative is death. Right. If we just
Right. And not just
even
physical
just
death.
let that lie and just
Mhm.
don't do anything about it.
Right. So the way to think of this, and again, we're back to this image because it ties together so well what's talked about in the book, and it helps us to speak sort of in broad terms about what's in the book without giving too much away.
Yeah.
Which is, there's this duality of the feminine, which is represented by Eve versus Mary, and Christ is often called the second Adam, and
Yeah.
sometimes he's called the Son of Man, uh, which is another paradox. But basically, um, it's a redo of Adam, and then it presents a redo for anybody else after that,
Yeah.
which is, if you participate in the symbol of Christ, then you become redeemed rather
Yes.
than corrupted and destroyed.
Very nicely put. Yeah.
Yeah. So the challenge, and maybe this is where it's challenging but possible to integrate the feminine, which is to say, to be more like Mary is
Oh,
to
yeah.
accept the paradox of the situation, the paradox of life, which is to be separate, to accept and obey and be a virgin, to give so it's basically, so like normally a mother goes through all of the pains of bearing a child, because there was the sexual act that had some sort of pleasure or desirable nature of it, and the desirable nature of having a child with, hopefully, a person that people that love each other.
Is Christ-like. Yeah.
Well, that's what normally happens, or should happen, with pregnancy. Although the paradox of Mary is, she was going to bear that child, and it was almost like her and her husband had to lie about it, although they never officially lied about it, in terms of like where the child was from.
Well, I put that there's a
Yeah.
joke in the book that
Mm.
where little Jesus asks
Little
Mary
Jesus. Yeah.
where do babies come from?
Okay.
And Joseph puts his head around the door and says, "Yeah, Mary, where do babies come from?"
Little Jesus, like, mommy. Um,
Exactly.
yeah. So the idea is that we are in this fallen state, and we do this progressively through life, where we know, like I said, in my practical interpretation, we know in just our natural conscience, as we develop our ego consciousness,
Yeah.
the right thing to do and what's wrong. And then when we violate that, we're sort of in that fallen state, like Adam is depicted. And then the redemption is to accept our suffering for that, and then we can be redeemed and become more like the second Adam, like Christ the Redeemer.
Yeah.
And so there's that duality of, although here's the interesting aspect of the Adam and Eve story too, is that like some actually argue that it wasn't only, well, like Eve is often depicted as getting too much blame for the situation, because one, Adam was supposed to be responsible for her. Adam was supposed to make sure that the situation didn't go the way that it did. And in fact, it partly did because he lied about it. Because God didn't say don't touch the tree. God just said don't eat of it. And so Adam was like the first fundamentalist that didn't just say, don't do this, don't do that. He said, don't even touch about it. Don't touch it. Don't think about it. Don't go near it. But then, of course, if you do that, then people get closer and closer until they hear the opposite of the conscience, which is, the snake in this case, right? The shadow, or the repression, because it's those sort of fundamentalist repressions that cause the shadow to get more and more like a devious snake that will lead to this. And then some would even argue further that Adam was given a second chance even after the fall, before the total destruction, before he was cursed, which is that he could have taken the responsibility and said, didn't have to lie about it, but he could say it was my fault because I was the one responsible here. But what he did is he tried to blame the snake and the devil when God confronted him.
Yeah. And Eve.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And Eve and the devil / snake, he tried to blame them rather than take responsibility. But that's the whole thing. If you take responsibility, that's taking up your cross, and then that's the redemption process. And because he didn't take responsibility, we had to go through the whole process of becoming Christ-like, which is the whole story that we've been trying to live out through human history.
Well, and I certainly felt that myself in my own life,
of taking responsibility.
My failure. My failure to take responsibility has been great. I'm not a particularly good person or special person, but I took responsibility at least for my own story. So that was
that's your road back.
That's my
road to redemption.
Yeah.
So,
and I highly recommend it for other people to do that too.
Right. That's kind of like the maybe thesis or call to action at the end, is just to tell that people get better at telling their own story. So I had one other question that kind of ties in here, not to this image again, but the other question is, it's how do conspiracies breed pathology? Like that's what we learned a few minutes ago. And
yeah,
but I think it has to do with what we were saying a minute ago, which is it's all the aspect of not taking responsibility. So we have our own responsibility to listen to our conscience, to be progressing towards even a practical, even metaphorical, whatever, heaven rather than hell, going in the right direction. When we violate that, we can become more and more increasingly corrupt. And the way to avoid that shame or maybe guilt, but the way to avoid it is to project out onto the world and be like, well, it's all the pedophiles' fault. It's all the corrupt people's fault. And then you're not dealing with your own. But as you, as someone who has experienced that, and in the telling of your book or the story of your book, how do you say that conspiracies can lead to pathology and the other issues that you cover in your book.
Well, there's a clear paradox again with
Mm.
conspiracies, right?
Right.
That conspiracies have always taken place.
Mm-hmm.
There will always be conspiracies, because conspire means to breathe together. That's all it means, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like inspire, and to breathe together.
Mm-hmm.
And I did some research and found that a lot of the conspiracies labeled as conspiracy theories were, for the most part, true or true. For the most part. And that led me to think in my own self of how I can be more true and honest. Because we've had the COVID pandemic,
Pandemic.
We've had things like 9/11 have happened and things like that. And they, to my mind, were clearly partly or fully conspiracies. Whether you agree with me or not doesn't matter too much. But I reached the point where I had to make a call of, or I became very aware of conspiracy as the evil in the world. And it just became symbolic to me of all of the evil in the world. Like every war is a conspiracy, because people are convinced to fight in a war, even though they don't understand why they're fighting.
Right.
And to kill other people and massacre innocent people. And being told to do that, and actually going through and doing that, going through with it, is just plain as evil as it gets, right? And then you see what's happening on our doorstep here in Hungary, in Ukraine, and it's like proper, real evil, evil shit going down. And where does that leave you as a person if you're aware of conspiracy, right? You could be aware of a conspiracy going on in your workplace or whatever, where someone has betrayed someone, or someone has thrown someone under the bus. Like people like to say, hey, don't throw me under the bus, right? Yeah, it's a common thing to say these days.
Yeah, we all been there.
And the world is full of conspiracy. It's a fact.
And
you don't have to talk about 9/11 to realize that that's the case. And so in my writing of the book, I became obsessed with this paradox of conspiracy and conspiracy theory. And how do you pick them apart? How do you pick apart the conspiracy and the conspiracy theory? And where's the point at which you have to say there's no flat earth, let's say. I don't believe the earth is flat.
You don't?
Okay, that's clear, right? Okay. But then there are other ones where I'm not so sure, chemtrails or whatever. And being confronted with this paradox was a strange experience, because because it's a conspiracy theory, you can't even talk about it. So you can't discuss anything of these issues with most people, right? So
especially not on Facebook.
it becomes very like a clique of people who are conspiracy theorists, and they are the ones who hold the gateway to truth, potentially. But you're not allowed to talk to them, or you're not allowed to listen to them. You're not allowed to be one of them, because if you're labeled a conspiracy theorist, then it's over. All your opinions become invalid.
Yeah, it's really challenging, because on one hand, like you said, there's always been conspiracy going on, and you could look at it almost if you look at it back to our human evolutionary history, maybe even if you say that we are biologically evolved from lower life forms of apes or whatever, you know, killing and killing to not be killed, and all these things are deeply embedded inside of our history as being animals, especially the weird place that humans are kind of like emerging from, almost at the bottom of the food chain to being at the pinnacle of it. And so over our history, we've gone from this position to where killing is like a constant fact of life, however many hundreds or thousands of years ago that you might say that was, to where now we're like, oh no, we should never do that, never be violent. Oh my God, I can't believe Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. All these unacceptableness of any kind of violence. But because it's still within us, it conspires to come out. And so like you're saying a few minutes ago, even in war, we shouldn't have wars. We should just maybe have negotiations, but not violent wars. But we have these drives within us to kill and be violent and everything else. So we make wars as the excuse for that. And now that we see that happening, where only certain people are still able to do so, only certain elite groups are able to kill and rape and be pedophiles and all the other horrible, evilest things that there are, or most evil, we project that out on them. And theory is an interesting word in this context, as well as in science and philosophy and everything else, because the challenge is to distinguish theory from fact. So a theory, we're constantly making theories. We're engineering and putting together and predicting the theories for what's going on in the world and what our place should be in that world. And that's what we should be doing, but it gets misconstrued sometimes with where we draw the line between having a hypothesis or a theory about the world compared to a known fact about the world. And then again, to this sort of how conspiracies lead to pathology is, it gets back to that repression idea. If into what you're saying a minute ago, the more that you say, no, you can't think that, you can't talk about that, even if we're in a nation where there's freedom of speech, even in America, whether you're using Facebook or just even just talking amongst your family, it's like, or even talking amongst yourself, it's like, you can't think that, you can't, because
exactly.
that ruins society, that ruins the fabric of reality. If you think like everybody goes to Epstein Island once they're at a certain level of power, and they say anything about it, they get killed by Clinton. So well,
right, that's exactly it. I mean, you say that, and that's exactly where it, Epstein Island is the biggest, like the most glaring example, right, of pure evil. If you consider pedophilia as like purest form of evil, right? Then Epstein Island is the most, like the pinnacle of evil in our current world. And the thing is about that is that you're really, the press aren't talking about it, even though it's an open secret and has been for years. And so there's no talking about this. And even like you talk to people and they say, yeah, Epstein Island, like you just did, and kind of laugh about it, right? Yeah, I mean, come on. Because it is absurd that these people think they can get away with it. And it kind of, I mean, it's kind of beyond the pale, basically. And anyway, in terms of pathology, I got caught up in the Q
QAnon.
QAnon,
Yeah.
and which was, I went too far.
Yeah.
At least I think I did, because I had hopium that this was a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
The expression or word hopium,
Oh yeah, like
like
opium for
opium
the.
but with hope. Yeah. So I was hopeful that this was true, and that's what tripped me out and led to my psychosis.
Yeah, and which is again why I find this story so interesting is because um, many people who generally with pot, it's bipolar 1 is what was triggered, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to get terms wrong. And so before that, you were kind of like undiagnosed with bipolar 2, is that right?
No, I was undiagnosed, completely undiagnosed.
Well, I mean, before that, would you say
I
it was
took
kind of like
some medication to help me sleep. That was my
right? But
understanding.
I mean, undiagnosed. So it's like, would you say um you were like bipolar 2, but just didn't know it before?
Yeah, you can be diagnosed with bipolar 1
Mm,
when you've had a psychosis event,
right.
when you've had a proper mania,
Proper mania.
because bipolar 2 people only ever reach hypermania, and then they
Right,
drop
which
back down and
right.
crash.
So that was like you at the beginning of the book,
Yeah,
give or take.
but I don't know if you diagnose bipolar 2 and then bipolar 1
Mm.
afterwards. You don't kind of graduate from one to the other. You're like, I had bipolar 1 the whole of my life, but I didn't realize it.
Yeah, but I
But
guess
it
it's
doesn't
just
matter too much because I've
well,
been diagnosed
but
now.
it's sort of like what happens in the book of this case history, which is that because of the events of your life, your midlife crisis and the sort of midlife crisis of the world with COVID and January 6th and the election and everything else that we're talking about with these conspiracies that were playing out at the time, that sort of was all kind of like seems like a thing that sort of unlocks that latent genetic disorder or mutation
Yeah.
of the bipolar 1 disorder. Is that sort of how you
Yeah, that's
experienced it?
right. Yeah. And
Hmm.
then different people have it in different ways. They don't
Right.
all get all conspiratorial about stuff, and
Right.
people just get psychosis, but they see aliens or
Mm.
they hallucinate things and stuff like that. That can happen.
Wow. Yeah, it happens in different ways. But
They can become
mm,
really paranoid about things
right,
as well.
right. Yeah, it's different for everybody. That was again, last time I kept grabbing these books, but that was something that Jung talked about in Flying Saucers, which is collected part or most of Collected Works Volume 10 of people seeing flying saucers at the time. It was part of a uh, mass hallucination, mass psychosis, which is that at the sort of we've always had this proclivity to see circular things, and so we project them out, and he's saying that's sort of like a projection of the self is to project out these images in the sky. So it's
Mhm.
funny because some people see a book of a psychologist or psychiatrist talking about flying saucers, and I think that's so weird, but it's an underappreciated topic, which it is sort of like the topic that we're on now, which is like uh there's a projection there to deal with, and some of it's real and some of it's not. Well, it's hard to say with things like flying saucers, but
Yeah, right. Yeah.
easier to distinguish maybe with the conspiracies like we mentioned today. But speaking of books, and we'll sort of wrap up with this idea, is we talked a little bit about this off and on, which is I think probably next month, July for us here. Adrian Courage and I are going to do some short reviews on some of the books that we both read, and I'll probably do some other ones with other people after that. So we'll go over Man into the Symbols.
Yeah.
You said you have Origin History of Consciousness, but haven't gotten to it yet. Is that right?
No, I've got it on audiobook.
Okay, it's
Audible.
good on audiobook, so maybe we'll do that later in the year. What else? Oh. Hopefully we'll get into Trauma in the Soul by Donald Kalshed. That's one we talked about a little bit last year. And then Art of Seduction by Robert Greene, and maybe some other Robert Greene books. I mentioned earlier Aeon. And what else? Laws of Power, probably Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert Johnson, and then some other Robert Johnson books. Maybe we'll get into I'd like to hear your opinion on if once you finish some Mihai Csikszentmihalyi books, at least Flow.
Yeah.
It's not a very long book, but it's interesting in these contexts of, like, I think it ties into what Jung calls the transcendent function. And then might get into Green Lights, Matthew McConaughey's book, which I mentioned last time that we did this podcast, because some of Matthew McConaughey's stuff in that book reminds me of some stuff that you went through in your book, not the infidelity or anything like that, but some of the sort of unofficial religious experiences. But yeah, do you want to say anything else about that? And then we'll wrap up here in a minute.
About the books?
About the books or anything else?
No, I look forward to talking about them. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that's it. Any other just closing thoughts or ideas, or what you're looking forward to now that the book is fully out there in the public and people have the chance to talk to you about it and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed our chat today. It was good.
Yeah. Sorry, it's a
better
little
than
late
the
for
last
you.
one that we
Yeah.
didn't get published.
Yeah.
We stayed too close to the book last time.
Yeah, which was something I didn't want to do too much, because don't want to give too much away. And so now I think we did the right amount of teasers for the book, so people will still feel compelled to get into it. But yeah, so stay tuned, and next month we'll get into some short book reviews and we'll go from there. So thanks a lot.
You put the stuff in the show notes, like
yeah,
links to the book and stuff.
Yeah, I'll have links to the book, links to your Twitter and everything like last time, and that way people can reach out to you if they want to know what it's like to go through your experience.
Cool.
All right, thanks a lot, Adrian. Stay archetypal. I'll see you around.
See ya.